بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله ومن والاه. باب من يجوز دفع الصدقات إليه ومن لا يجوز. Those to whom it is permitted to pay zakah and those to whom it is not permitted. قال الله تعالى, and this is verse number 60 of Surah Tawbah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم. So in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions 8 categories of people who can receive zakat. And then the Musannif rahimahullah ta'ala adds to that, وَقَدْ سَقَطَ مِنْهَا الْمُؤَلَّفَةُ قُلُوبُهُم, that one of the categories of mu'allafatul qulub, that is no longer a recipient for zakat. Why? لأن الله تعالى عز الإسلام وأغنى عنهم, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored Islam and freed the need of it. We'll discuss about what that means in just a moment. And so the verse of Surah Al-Tawbah, verse 60, it translates to zakat is for number 1, the poor, number 2, the destitute, number 3, those who collect it, number 4, reconciling people's heart, and this is the mu'allafatul qulub that we were talking about. Number 5, freeing slaves. Number 6, those in debt. Number 7, spending in the way of Allah. And number 8, for the traveler. Farizatan min Allah, it is an obligation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahu alimun hakim, and Allah is all knowing and all wise. Right? So these are the 8 categories that initially could receive zakat, but one of them, mu'allafatul qulub, can no longer receive zakat. So now he's defining each of these categories, and he mentions wal faqir man lahu adna shay, wal miskin man la shay lahu, that a faqir person, a poor person, is who has very little things, possessions, i.e. possessions that do not reach the nisab, right? All that he has in his possession is something that does not reach the nisab. And miskin is destitute, is someone la shay lahu, who has nothing at all, right? Some say it's the opposite. A faqir is someone who has nothing at all, and a miskin is someone who has something but it does not reach nisab. Either way, it doesn't really matter when we talk about faqir or miskin in Babu Zakat. They're both entitled. The differences between the two terms, they manifest in Kitabul Wasaya when you're making a bequest or you're making another. But as far as zakat is concerned, there is no difference between faqir and miskin in terms of who can receive zakat. So these are the first 2 categories. And number 3 is وَالْعَامِلِ يَدْفَعُ إِلَيْهِ الْإِمَامِ إِنْ عَمِلَ بِقَدْرِ عَمَلِهِ, that the one who administers zakat, an amil, the person who collects zakat on behalf of the imam, right? And obviously this category only existed or exists when the government collects zakat from the people, and in case where people pay their own zakat, there is no existence of an amil, and so you can't give it to them in zakat. Now, one question someone might ask is, what about those different institutions that collect zakat from people in order to use it? Can they be an amil, or can they act in the capacity of an amil and receive some sort of processing fee in order to some sort of processing fee for their services in collecting zakat. It is best if they have other means not to take this fee, especially if they're like collecting other forms of sadaqat and stuff like that. They should take their processing fee and charges from those funds and leave the zakat fund to be. But if there are no other funds available, and for example, you're living in a place where it's impossible to find someone who might be mustahiq zakat, who can receive zakat, and like it's really troublesome finding someone you can give to, and then you go toward such institutions to make sure your zakat is paid, then it's okay if they charge a minimal processing fee, a fee which covers their basic expenses. So they can't act as a profit earning organization, but they can take a amount that is enough to process this whole situation, for their employees and stuff like that, but it should not be aimed at making a business model out of it. That is something we need to be careful of, right? So anyhow, the third category was of the amil who could collect zakat according to what they have worked for, right? So you can't, so there's no specified amount on how much an amil is supposed to be given. It usually depended on how much they actually worked. So if they're going far, traveling a lot, so they probably earn a bit more. But if they're just collecting it within the city and stuff, not that much. So although they do get according to what they perform, but it cannot be more than half. It'll defeat the purpose of zakat altogether if you're just giving everything to the amil and nothing for the actual people who were deserving of zakat. Number four is wafir riqab, and that refers to the muqatabun. So you can assist those slaves who've made a pact with their masters that if they can provide them with XYZ amount of money, in exchange for that, their masters will release them. So such slaves can be assisted in securing their release from slavery by giving them zakat. Now, this does not mean that you can pay the enemy to release prisoners, right? That is something else because we'll come to know one of the conditions of zakat is tamlik, ownership. So if you're paying the prison guard or if you're paying the prison owner in order to release a certain captive, there's no tamlik being found. There's no ownership given to the needy. So that's why zakat will not be paid. So you have to be careful that you can't use this money to actually go release prisoners because the concept of tamlik or the aspect of tamlik will be absent over there. Number five is gharim, and the gharim is the person who is in debt. Is obligated in debt, and when you remove all the debt, he does not have the nisab left with him. Wafi sabilillah, in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anyone being prevented to earn, prevented from having a job, so they're living in poverty, struggling in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those people are also entitled to zakat. This obviously includes the ghuzat, those people fighting in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala against enemies. This could also include munqatul hajj, maybe a person performing hajj, but they got cut off from their tribe, cut off from their caravan, from their group, no way to contact them or their family back home. So they're pretty much stuck there without anything. And this could also include anything basically, which is for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is for the cause of Islam, where the people involved there are needy, are so engaged that they really can't work to provide for themselves. All of these people will be entitled to zakat, and that's category seven, right? And category 8 was al-mu'allafatu qulubuhum, which we mentioned can no longer be given zakat. And what this group was initially when someone new accepted Islam in Islam's infancy, what the Prophet Islam would used to do would sometimes give zakat to those people in order to make them more steadfast on Islam. So obviously, mal is something, wealth is something that fitratan humans are ingrained to actually love it, right? All of us are built in this way. It, the difference is in the intensity of it, but everybody has some form of love for wealth. So those kibar of the Quraysh or of the Kuffar in the time of the Prophet, whom he hoped that if they became Muslimin, then their tribes would follow. Either influence would also impact a lot of other people in making the decision to come towards Islam. So what he would do was sometimes give those people that wealth. So what basically was happening was a transaction in which, obviously, because Islam is it's in its infancy, uh, there's questions and there's problems about protecting the lives of the Muslimin, their wealth, preventing the Kuffar and other tribes of Arab to actually attack the Muslimin. And so what the Prophet was doing at that time was trying to amass influence, trying to amass more numbers so that the Islamic State and the Awalul Muslimin would be in a position where people would not bat an eye towards them. So basically, in exchange for giving it to the poor people, that money or that wealth would be used in order to protect them, protect whatever remaining wealth they had, protect their lives, and so on. But after Islam got really well established, time of Abu Bakr, in time of Umar radiallahu anhu, it was agreed unanimously that it's not in that same weak state anymore. So the reason behind why Mu'allafat Qulub were being given zakat in the first place no longer existed. And so that's why there's no need to pay them zakat anymore. And so this eighth category of the recipients of zakat doesn't did not exist anymore. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So these are the people you can give zakat to. You can give it to just one category, or you can divide it amongst all categories, or more than one category, however you choose, right? Some I must say you have to give zakat to each one of these categories in order for it to be complete. But according to Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala, there's no need. You can just give it to any one category, and that's still okay. Your zakat will still be paid. So we've covered al-bahth al-awwal, in which we talked about those who can receive zakat. Now we're going to talk about the conditions of zakat, or the conditions of the recipient of zakat. So the first condition is al-Islam, that the person must be a Muslim. And so that's why the Musannaf rahimahullah ta'ala says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ أَن يُدْفَعَ الزَّكَاةُ أَوْ يَدْفَعَ الزَّكَاةَ إِلَى ذِمِّيٍّ. That is not permissible that you should give your zakat to a dhimmi person, a non-Muslim living under Islamic rule, right? Because Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, when he was being sent to Yemen, the Prophet Islam instructed him about zakat. أي خذها من أغنيائهم وردها في فقرائهم, that you should be taking the zakat from the aghniya of the Muslimin, the rich, and then giving it back to the poor of the Muslimin, right? And so that is why a lot of Aimma say that if it weren't for the hadith of Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, we would have said that zakat can also be given to the non-Muslims. So condition number one is Islam of the recipient. ولا يبنى بها مسجد ولا يكفن بها ميت ولا يقضى بها دين ميت ولا تشترى بها رقبة تعتق. Nor should a masjid be built with the mal of zakat, nor a deceased person be shrouded with it, nor a slave be bought and set free. And the underlying condition in all three of these examples, 2 to 4, is their tamlik is not present. So condition number 2 is tamlik. You should actually give ownership to the person you're giving zakat to. So building a mosque, there is no ownership involved. Shrouding a deceased, there is no ownership involved because a deceased can't own anything. Nor buying a slave to set him free, there is no ownership involved there either because you're not making the slave malik of the mal. You're giving the mal to the master and then setting him free. So the condition of tamlik is not present in these three examples, and so that's why zakat cannot be used for such means. So similarly, zakat cannot be given to hospitals, for example. They're charity hospitals, so you can't give them zakat. There's a scenario where you can do that. So usually you give zakat, there's a zakat fund in hospitals, you give it to them, and they don't use it willy-nilly however they want. What happens is whenever someone poor who can't afford comes in, what they do is obviously they need treatment, may need medicines, maybe need surgery. So what happens is they're told that we have a zakat fund. Your medicines would amount to this much money, your surgery might amount to this much money. We'll give you this in zakat, but not in form of money, but in form of the medicines, right? Obviously, surgery has the problem that the concept of ownership is not present, so that becomes a bit tricky. But as far as medicine is concerned, uh, that poor person is given from the zakat fund in the form of medicines. So in that scenario, in that sense, it is acceptable to give zakat to such hospitals who take care of this. By normal circumstances, you can't even give zakat to a hospital, for example. Condition number 3 is adamul ghina or faqr, that the person must be needy, right? And so that's why wala tudfa ila ghaniyin. Number 5, that zakat should not be paid to a wealthy person, right? Because obviously zakat is again for the poor. And just like you can give it to the wealthy person, wala yudfa ila waladi ghaniyin as-saghir wala mamluki ghani. Similarly, a rich person's small child, he can also not get zakat, receive zakat, because a minor is considered subservient to the father, which means if the father is rich, that child will also be considered rich, and if he's poor, then the child will also be considered poor. As far as adult children are concerned, those who reach puberty, they no longer tabi' lil ab, not subservient to the father. So their ghina and faqr is not the same as their father's. So if the father is rich but the adult daughter or son, they're poor, then you can give them zakat. Similarly, the mother's wealth does not concern the child either. So if the mother, for example, is rich, the father isn't, or there is no father in a scenario, and the child is poor, then he can be given zakat. And if a rich person has a slave, the slave can also not receive zakat because, again, the slave is an extension of the master, and since the master is rich, the slave will also be rich. So condition number 3 was faqr, that poverty should be present in the one receiving zakat. Condition 4 is adamu qarabatil wilad. There should not be blood relations, ancestral blood relations, or a descendant who can receive zakat. And so he mentions ولا يدفع المزكي زكاته إلى أبيه وجده وإن علا ولا إلى ولده وولد ولده وإن سفل ولا إلى أمه وجداته وإن علت. That one cannot give zakat to his or her own father, grandfather, great grandfather, however high, son, grandson, granddaughter, granddaughter, however low. Similarly, mother or grandmothers, however high. So anyone related to you, either your ancestors or your descendants, and they cannot be given zakat to. Condition number 5 is admu zawjiyah. A husband cannot give zakat to his own wife. Uh, the question then, can a wife give zakat to her husband? According to Imam Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala and Imam Malik and Imam Ahmad, لا تدفع المرأة إلى زوجها, that a wife can also not pay her husband zakat. But the Sahibain rahimahullah ta'ala, they say that the wife can actually pay the husband zakat. And what they have is a hadith mentioned in Muslim in which two women came to the door of the Prophet ﷺ, and they sent Bilal radiallahu anhu asking a question. Would they get ajr if they give their sadaqah to their husbands and to those children living under their care? And the Prophet said, Laki ajran, ajru sadaqah wa ajru sila, that you get two rewards. You get the reward of sadaqah and you get the reward of silatul rahim as well, right? Now, obviously, we previously mentioned that sadaqah is a more umbrella term. Zakat is a form of sadaqah. And so the Sahibain and Imam Shafi rahmahullah ta'ala, what they basically say is that this hadith tells us that she can give zakat. The other Aimma are in the opinion that no, this sadaqah refers to a sadaqah and nafila and not zakat, right? In normal cases, the fatwa is that the wife also cannot give zakat to her husband, but in really dire scenarios, uh, she may give it to her husband. But in normal circumstances, it's not allowed for her to give him zakat, just like it's not allowed for him to give her zakat. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam bis-sawab. So this was condition number 5, ay admu zawjiyah. There should not be a spousal relation between the giver and the recipient. Condition number 6 is that the recipient of zakat should not be uh, owned by the giver. ولا يدفع إلى مقاتبه ولا مملوكه ولا مملوك غني وولد غني إذا كان صغير. So one cannot give his own slave zakat. Neither can he give any other slave zakat, because slaves essentially don't have any ownership. Whatever they own belongs to their masters, right? So if you give your own slave zakat, that basically is putting money into your own pocket. Wouldn't make sense. Giving another person's slave zakat also wouldn't make sense, because you're basically putting it into the pocket of the master. And if the master is owning a slave, it means he's rich. These people or these slaves were not cheap. They really weren't cheap. Sometimes when we hear these ahadith and hear these masail, we think that maybe there wasn't so much value in them, but that's not the truth. The reality is that they were valued very high. They were very expensive. Slaves were actually very expensive, maybe more expensive than the cars that you or I drive, or maybe even more expensive than a lot of houses that we live in. And with that, you can imagine the kind of sakhawa that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to have, that they would just set them free. I mean, that is taking on a lot of, in a capitalist sense, financial loss, so to speak, just to set them free. But that is what you get when you have iman inside your hearts. It's easy to spend in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anyhow, giving your own muqatab zakat doesn't work. Giving someone else or any of your other slaves zakat doesn't work. Slave of a wealthy person doesn't work. Son of a wealthy person, if he's a minor, also won't work for the reason we mentioned, that his ghina and faqr is that of his father. So that was condition 6, that the recipient of zakat should not be owned by anyone in any way. Seventh condition is that the recipient should not be related to the Prophet ﷺ. وَلَا يَدْفَعْ إِلَى بَنِي Hashim. You should also not be giving it to Bani Hashim. And who are the Bani Hashim? آل علي وآل عباس وآل جعفر وآل أقيل وآل حارث بن عبد المطلب ومواليهم. And the family of Ali, Abbas, Ja'far, Aqil, Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib, and those slaves freed by people of these tribes. Why can't you give Bani Hashim zakat? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, يا بني هاشم إن الله تعالى حرم عليكم قسالة الناس وأوساخهم وعوزكم منها بخمس الخمس. That Bani Hashim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the filth of people's wealth haram on you, which is zakat, and in exchange has given you khamsul khums, a fifth of the spoils of war. So whatever spoils of war the Muslims used to get, a fifth of it was for the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Now there are two questions that we need to ask. First of all, how to determine who is Banu Hashim? Because you would see a lot of people don't know how they're Banu Hashim. Like how are they Sayyid, or how are they Abbasi or Alawi, right? Or Husseini. A lot of people say they are, but do they have proof of that? Or more importantly, the question, do we need proof of that? That's question number one. Question number two is, we no longer have spoils of war. There is no such jihad, even if there is. The concept of ghanima, that's not acted upon a lot. So we don't have that. So in our day and age, are Bani Hashim able to receive zakat? Because the reason why they weren't being given zakat, because they had a substitute, the ghanima. They don't have that anymore. So will they be treated like normal people, or you still can give it to them? As far as question number one is concerned, you don't need to have tangible evidence in order to establish your nasab. Uh, so thubut nasab, or your lineage, it's based on tasamuh. There's a lot of leeway there. So if someone's famous, if their family is famous for being Sayyid, if their family is famous for being a Alawi or Abbasi, that's enough for you to accept that they are. You don't need to go and ask them to show you their family tree and stuff like that. So if they're saying that their family is famous for not being amongst Banu Hashim, that is sufficient evidence. You don't need to go full researcher mode. Question number two, there are some ulama, some fuqaha, who say that in our times it is permissible to give Banu Hashim the zakat for the reason we mentioned, that there's no Baitul Mal, there's no khums, nothing like that. So how do you help them out? You can give them zakat. But usually people are afraid to give fatwa on this, right? Usually they're afraid to give fatwa on this. The fatwa still stands that you cannot give Banu Hashim zakat. You can help them out by other means, by other forms of sadaqat, through gifts and stuff. A lot of ajr in that for your intention. But as far as zakat is concerned, you can't give it to them. There's also a third opinion that says that Banu Hashim can give zakat to Banu Hashim. Right? So the rich of the Bani Hashim can give zakat to the poor of the Bani Hashim. This again is an opinion which fatwa is usually not given, but personally speaking, this feels more close at home to me than the other opinion. Again, this is for the sake of intellectual knowledge, but as far as the fatwa is concerned, it still stands that you cannot give Banu Hashim a zakat. Do help them out when you can, but in other means. Now, so these were the 7 conditions that should be present in a recipient of the zakat. I'll just quickly summarize them. Number 1 is Islam. Number 2 is there should be tamlik. Number 3 is that person should be faqir. Number 4 is that there should be uh, a relation of ancestry or descendants amongst the recipient and the giver. Number 5, there should not be spousal relation between them. Number 6, the recipient should not in any form be owned by the giver. And number 7 is that they should not be from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. On that, let's go back to condition number 3, al-faqr, being needy. Two things are excluded, like excluded from the rule is first the amil, the person who's collecting zakat. So the person who's collecting zakat, even if he's rich, he can still take from that malu zakat because he's not getting because of his poverty, he's getting because of the amal that he's doing, the collection that he's doing. So it's more of a fee than the actual meaning of the sadaqah, but he can still receive that. The second person is Ibn Sabil, right? So Ibn Sabil is the person who was traveling. Oh, I might have actually missed this one when talking about the recipients of zakat. So Ibn Sabil is the person who is basically in travel. Although he has wealth in his homeland, where he is right now, he doesn't have anything, nor does he have the means to access his wealth back home. At that time, it was pretty understandable. If you're traveling, you're out of money, so you're out of money. You could be a prince back home, but if you're 1,000 miles away with nothing, you're still poor. Nowadays, like if your master and Visa cards are working, it doesn't matter if you're from Australia, but right now you're in Japan or maybe somewhere else. If your cards are working or if your internet is working, you can ask people back home to send it to you. Then you're not poor, you're not Ibn Sabil, and you can't receive zakat. But if you have no means of connection and your cards aren't working either, then you would be Ibn Sabil in this case. So that's another exclusion that although a person might be rich technically speaking, but since they're not rich at the moment or for actual purposes and needs, they could be considered as recipients of zakat. Now, some examples of when tamlik or ownership uh, happens and when it doesn't happen. وقال أبو حنيفة ومحمد رحمه الله تعالى إذا دفع الزكاة إلى رجل يظنه فقير ثم بان أنه غني أو حاشمي أو كافر. Scenario 1, someone gives zakat to a person thinking that they're faqir, right? And then they realize or it comes to light that they were actually rich or they were from Banu Hashim or they weren't even Muslim in the first place. Case number 2, دفع في ظلمة إلى فقير ثم بان أنه أبوه أو ابنه. It was pitch black. They gave zakat to someone, a faqir person, and afterwards they realized it was actually uh, relate. The person was related to them. Either it was the father or the son. In both cases, according to the Sahibain, la i'adata alayhi, the person does not need to repay the zakat. It will be considered given. وقال أبو يوسف رحمه الله تعالى عليه الإعادة As far as Abu Yusuf Rahmatullah is concerned, he says that repayment is incumbent upon that person. It's wajib. Well, obviously, Abu Yusuf Rahmatullah's reasoning is clear. He gave zakat to a person who was not a recipient. In the first case, he was either rich, a Hashimi, or non-Muslim. In the second case, it was his father or son. None of them meet all the requirements necessary to be a recipient of the zakat. So, zakat not paid, you have to do it again, right? But the Tarafain rahmahullah ta'ala, they have hadithu Ma'an ibn Yazid. So what happened is that father and son, Yazid was father and Ma'an was the son. And so in the middle of the night, what happened is obviously because a lot of the fuqara didn't have homes, so they would used to live in Masjid al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam in those times. And so usually if you'd see a person amongst the Ashab Sufa where Sufa was, or generally in Masjid Nabawi at night time, not praying, sleeping, it will usually mean that that person is poor, right? And so Yazid radiallahu anhu, he comes and he has zakat in his hand, he wants to give. In the night, he doesn't know, but he keeps it beside the person, indicating that this is zakat and this is for you. Then he goes back home. Sometime later, his son, Ma'an, comes back with a packet full of darahim. And Yazid radiallahu anhu, he realizes that this is the one that I give. And he was like, this was not intended for you. I gave it out as zakat. But his son Man was kept on saying that you gave it to me, so it's mine. And so this argument kept on increasing until they went to the Prophet ﷺ and presented to him what had happened. And the Prophet Islam, he mentioned, Ya Yazid laka ma nawait wa ya Ma laka ma akhad. That Yazid, for you is your intention. You intended to pay zakat, you did not give it to your son on purpose, your zakat is paid. And then said, Ma'an, for you is what you took. So whatever was given to you is now yours. You don't have to give it back. From this hadith, we know that if a person gives zakat to someone who does not meet the requirement and they made their full effort to know exactly the reality behind it, and it turns out some conditions are not being met, you don't have to repay the zakat, right? So obviously it's impossible to know 100% whether or not a person is ghani or faqir. You can't check their balance. Whether by just normal appearance a person might be a Muslim or non-Muslim, right? Especially if they're living in a Muslim country or even a non-Muslim country, you just can't know. You can't rip apart a person's heart and know that. So just like when the Qibla becomes mushtabih, you don't know where the Qibla is, you do ijtihad, try your best to find out, and then whatever direction you pray, your prayer is acceptable. Same goes here. If you did your ijtihad, try to find out, and then you came to the decision that no, this person is a recipient, and you give them zakat, fair enough, even if they don't turn out to be, your zakat is still paid. But if you did not do your due diligence, or if you did not make any form of ijtihad, right, then your zakat will not be paid. So for example, what happens is, if you do tahari, you try to find out, and then dominant assumption is that this person is a recipient, you give it to them, they don't turn out to be one, zakat paid. But if you're doubtful, either this person is or is not, and you don't do tahari, you don't try to find out, right? Or you do tahari, but your dominant assumption is that this person is not a recipient, and you give it to them anyways, and then it turns out that they actually were not, then you have to repay your zakat. Because what was wajib on you was to get the dominant assumption to find whether they are recipients. and you either did not try to establish that assumption, number one, or you established it on the other end of the spectrum in which they were not. So because the taqsir, the shortcoming was from your side, your zakat will be considered not paid and you would have to repeat. But if you did your ijtihad, your taharri, you came to the decision that no, this person can receive zakat, that is what was wajib on you. You completed the wajib. You have to do nothing else. The 21st century, you're giving zakat to an institution. You don't know where that zakat from the institution goes to. So you can do your taharri. Can you give them zakat? So your taharri is to do that of the institution itself. If the institution is well respected, trusted amongst your community, or even trusted amongst the international Muslim community, that is enough taharri for you. If it's backed by respected and trustworthy ulama and muftiyan, that is your taharri. That is all you need to do. You don't need to go into their accounts. You don't need to track the money from the time you enter it to where exactly it's ending up to. You're not mukallaf of that. You're mukallaf just to make sure that the institution that you're giving to is not a scam. They're not embezzling the funds. That is enough. If they're well respected, well trusted, you know someone inside who you trust, who's working there, and who's telling you it's okay, go for it. That's all that you need to do. Wallahu a'lam bisawab. However, ولو دفع إلى شخص ثم علم أنه عبده أو مقاطبه لم يجوز في قولهم جميعا. If a person pays someone zakat and then they realize it's their own slave or their own muqatab, everybody agrees such a payment is not valid. For the reasons we mentioned, because slaves don't have ownership, that means giving your own slave zakat is giving your own self zakat, and that does not work in any way whatsoever. So you have to repay zakat in this scenario. Who else can you not give zakat to? ولا يجوز دفع الزكاة إلى من يملك نصاب من أي مال كان. ويجوز دفعها إلى من يملك أقل من ذلك وإن كان صحيحا مكتسبا. Payment of zakat is not permitted to someone who owns nisab in any form of property. But if someone has less than that, then you can give them zakat, even though they may be healthy and they may be able to earn. But because they don't reach nisab, you can still give them zakat. There are three types of nisab. There is nisabu daf'i zakat, nisabu man'i zakat, or nisabu hurmat sual. The first nisab is that if you have it, it is wajib that you pay zakat. And those are the type of ansiba that we've been discussing. The nisab of gold, silver, trade stocks, of animals, of crops. Talked about that. If you have that nisab, then you have to give zakat. Then there's a nisab in which you don't have to give zakat, but neither can you accept zakat. That is the second nisab that he's mentioning over here, that if someone has property of any form that reaches nisab, the amount of nisab, then you can give zakat to them. So maybe you have enough property, although it's not the kind of property in which there is zakat wajib, right? So you have your own house, you have your own car, you have, I don't know, mobile phones, laptops, books, all of these things. Some of them may not be even in use. A lot of clothes that are not in use. So although because they're not trade items, you don't have to pay zakat. But if their value reaches that of nisab, then you can't accept zakat either. So that's the second nisab, right? The third nisab is nisabu hirman iswal, that if you have that much amount of money, you are not allowed to ask. A begging is out of the question. And that nisab is basically food for uh, an entire day and clothes for the entire day. If you have enough food that you can go buy the entire day, you're not allowed to ask anyone. You cannot beg. It is haram to do so. That is the third type of nisab. Over here, he's only mentioning the second type of nisab, and that if a person, they don't reach the nisab in which you pay zakat, that you reach the second nisab, you can give them zakat. If they have less than second nisab, you can give them zakat. But if they have enough to feed themselves for a day and night, then they can't ask. So they can't ask, but you can give it to them. ويكره أن يدفع إلى واحد 200 درهم فصاعدا. Sorry, wrong masla. ويكره نقل الزكاة من بلد إلى بلد آخر وإنما تفرق صدقة كل قوم فيهم. Transfer of zakat from one land to another is disliked, disapproved. Over here, karaha refers to karaha tanzihiyya, right? So the zakat of each land should be used in that same land, right? Uh, it should be distributed within the same group, unless أن يحتاج أن ينقلها إنسان إلى قرابته. The person wants to transfer to their deserving relatives in some other land. أو إلى قوم هم أحوج إليه من أهل بلده. Or they wish to give it to a group needier than the people of their own land. Then it is permissible, approved that you transfer zakat from your land to someplace else. If all's all the same, you don't have any relatives, and the people of the other land are not as more needy as those in your land, it is best that you do not give it to them, but you give it to those of your own land. It is not haram or uh, impermissible or anything. It's just that it's not approved of. But obviously, you would probably find a lot of places who could use your zakat more than people of your own land, especially Ahlul Gaza at this time. Uh, is a very vibrant example of how this transference can and should take place. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam bisawab.